Live from the WISC-TV studios in Madison, this is the Madison Mayoral Debate. A good evening to those joining us on WISC-TV and online at channel3000.com. I'm News 3's Eric Franke. We are just days away now from when the polls open on Election Day, and two candidates, each very familiar to Madison, are hoping to convince you tonight and earn your vote for Madison's mayor. Dave Cheslevich is the incumbent mayor of Madison since 2003. He sought and won re-election in 2007. A native of West Allis, a UW-Madison graduate. Prior to his time as mayor, he co-founded and served as first executive director of Thousand Friends of Wisconsin, a nonprofit focusing on land use and transportation issues. He has also served as director of government relations for the Nature Conservancy. The 52-year-old lives in the Regent neighborhood. Paul Soglin served on the Common Council before becoming mayor of Madison in 1973, was re-elected twice before leaving government, practicing law in Madison. He returned as mayor from 1989 until 1997 when he ran unsuccessfully for U.S. Congress. Soglin, born in Chicago, graduated both undergrad and law school from UW-Madison. Currently, he's on leave as a community development advisor for the Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority. The 65-year-old lives in the Sunset Hills neighborhood. Now, here is the format tonight. Each candidate will get 2 minutes to respond to the question. In some cases, we may offer another minute of open discussion where both candidates can jump into the discussion. And with that, we get started tonight. Now, we flipped a coin tonight to see who would get the first question, and it will go to Mayor Dave Cheslevich. And we'll start tonight by talking about an issue so important to so many in Wisconsin. That's jobs. Now, a key component to creating and growing jobs is courting new businesses, keeping those who are already here happy. You both have been mayor of Madison at a time when, fair or not, Madison has gotten a reputation of perhaps being unfriendly to business. So my first question to you, Mayor Cheslevich, would be, how do you change that?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Channel 3 for hosting this debate. I'm very pleased in this election to have the support of both labor and business, both the Chamber of Commerce, Downtown Madison Incorporated, and virtually every union that has endorsed in this election has endorsed me. And that's because they believe that I can create jobs here in the city of Madison, that we together can create jobs here in the city of Madison. Madison continues to have a very strong economy compared to the rest of the country, 4.4% unemployment rate. Now that's too high for Madison, but it compares well to just about any other community in our country. But we can't rest on our laurels. We need to do better. And so we're concentrating on things like the Capital East District, where ShopOp, a major new company, an exciting new company, is moving in 200 jobs, perhaps 400 jobs there in the next 2 years, taking over 200,000 square feet. And that's going to be a catalyst to ignite that whole East Washington Capital District. We have the Second University Research Park, another important economic engine to our city, the BioAg Gateway on the southeast side. We've been investing in economic development, created the first economic development director position in the city, revised our economic development plan for the first time in 30 years. So we're moving the city forward. We have been successful, but we really need to invest in the modern economy, and that's what we plan to do in the next 4 years.
Mayor Soglin.
Thank you. Recently, a woman here in Madison came up to me and spoke about her son, and she said very simply, what I'm interested in is that my son complete his education successfully, that he get a good job here in Madison, and be able to afford to live in our community. And that's really what this is all about. It's about Madison people and their ability to contribute to our society and to make a fine home here in Madison. When I was mayor during the 1990s, you got to remember that that term started out with a very deep recession. We were either first or second in unemployment in the United States. We traded places occasionally with Lincoln, Nebraska. Once in a while, once every few years, we'd slip into third place. But we were the leader in the United States in terms of creating jobs. Now, if you look at the latest statistics for last year from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we were 267th. I mean, most people can't even name that many cities in the U.S. in terms of creating jobs. We can do better, we will do better, and we have to approach it several ways. First, we have to approach it from the standpoint of what an employer wants. An employer wants an educated, trained workforce. That means we have to work together with the county, with educational institutions, with various agencies that work in creating, not only creating jobs, but in-job training. We have to meet the needs of the employer in providing that quality workforce. Second thing we need to do is we have to create an atmosphere for building and developing. For too long now, we've had too many conflicts that drag out as we attempt to reconcile differences between neighborhood activists, developers, and people focused on economic development. We should be on the same page. We can be on the same page. I'm convinced, given the record that I've demonstrated in the past, we can make Madison happen again.
Mayor Soglin, thank you to both of you. We'll leave that question right there. Let's talk for a moment, kind of also along those lines of jobs, and because that's certainly central to this discussion, but let's talk about what's happening at the Capitol and how it impacts Madison. With the high number of government workers that make up Madison's population, increased spending, they'll have to, fork over more money now for health care, pensions, all those sorts of things. Of course, that means less money for Madison residents to spend. Given that, can you build a strong economy when potentially all that money is taken out of their pockets? We'll start with Mayor Soglin.
There is going to be a difficulty that we encounter on several different levels. Most of the discussion up until now has focused on the loss of revenue for government and what that means to services. We've seen the discussion focused on the contribution that the public employees will now have to make to their health insurance and to their retirement contributions. But the point you're raising is one that's been discussed very little, and it's very critical, which is what does it mean to have hundreds of millions of dollars in the next few years taken out of our economy and, in effect, not available for purchasing homes, renting, purchasing food, and all the things that are the elements of a strong economy. It makes it that much more important that we do several things. The first of which is, and fortunately we've been doing this in Madison for several decades, growing the private sector. So we're not so dependent upon the public sector, the educational institutions, the government employment in the city, the county, and the state. Second thing that we need to do is we have to, in effect, re-examine how we manage government. We had some excellent efforts in the past to have quality management, efforts to provide services more efficiently. That's important because the tax dollars are limited. And if we can be frugal, if we can provide high quality services, in effect, that's one way of making up the lost revenues. The third thing I want to mention, because we've had two discussions about, in effect, the economy and jobs, is we've got a significant number of households in this community that are below the poverty line. There are steps we can take to coordinate all the essential services they need, already existing without spending more money, to get them into the economy.
Thank you, Mayor Soglin. 2 minutes, Mayor Cheslevich.
Well, of course, I oppose Governor Walker's draconian divisive budget. It will take $250 million out of the Dane County economy, and that's just for the impact on state and local employees alone. Then you look at some of the other things he's done, slashing the earned income tax credit. Do you know that a single mother with 2 children earning $15,000 a year will take a $302 cut under the governor's proposed biennial budget? And that's just for starters. So this governor has proposed a budget that will divide us, that will take money out of our economy, not just for state employees, but for others as well. And so we need to do a couple of things. First of all, we need to diversify our economy. Now, the University Research Park, the Capital East Gateway that I talked about earlier, the BioA Gateway, that's all part of that. That's all taking ideas, many that come from the university, incubating them in a research park, and then having those ideas develop fully out in our community, employing Madisonians. The second thing we need to do is we really need to focus on buying local. Every dollar that's spent in a local business in our community recirculates 7 times in our community. We really need to emphasize local buying power because the cuts that we take, that $250 million, will fall most heavily on small, locally grown businesses. If you think about it, in your family budget, the first thing that goes, the first thing that's paid is your mortgage. Probably the second thing is maybe a car payment. And what's going to be hurt is the local businesses, the restaurants, the flower shops, the clothing stores. So we need to rededicate ourselves to buying local.
And I encourage you both, if you ever want to engage in a discussion after you hear somebody's answer and you want to differ from their opinion at all, feel free to do so. We have a minute set aside after each question for general discussion. We've talked about the state capitol. We've talked about the economy to a degree. And we've also want to mention that several News 3 viewers have submitted questions through various social media, Facebook, Twitter, email, and we'll share some of those questions tonight throughout the hour. And this one is from a viewer, James Richters, and this is via email. And he writes, quote, recently in the news, you, Mayor Cheslevich, were shown joining protesters at the Capitol. But if you're, quote, in bed with public employees and their unions, who represents management, i.e., the taxpayers on the other side of the collective bargaining table? Both of you have come out in support of the unions. How can you effectively represent taxpayers at the bargaining table? And we begin with Mayor Cheslevich for this question.
First of all, thank you for that question. I was proud to join protesters at the Capitol just about every day that they were up there. I thought that what Governor Walker has proposed is one of the most divisive things that I have seen proposed in this state in my entire lifetime. Collective bargaining works. And the governor, for I think political reasons of his own, has decided that he wants to wipe out 40 years of labor peace. You know, we haven't had a municipal or teacher employee strike in this state in decades, thanks to collective bargaining. And so I strongly oppose that legislation. And so I was proud to join our firefighters who were endorsing me, our police officers who were endorsing me, AFSCME who was endorsing me. I was proud to join them in those demonstrations. But at the same time, I can sit across the table just like this and negotiate with them in good faith under collective bargaining. That's exactly what we did. The unions came to us and they suggested that they could take $5.3 million in cuts next year to help us balance our budget in exchange for a joint effort on our part to try to not lay anyone off. And I don't want to lay anyone off either. I don't want to lay off police officers, firefighters, people who plow our streets. This is a great example of how collective bargaining works. We sit across from the table, we disagree sometimes, we argue sometimes, but at the end of the day, collective bargaining works both for the employees and taxpayers.
And you feel you're, as James points out here, you are representing the taxpayers in this whole equation as well?
Absolutely.
Okay. Mayor Soglin.
Well, part of what the mayor has said I agree with, which is namely that you can be supportive of collective bargaining, you can be supportive of these labor organizations when they're under assault, as we all are, from the governor's budget. I don't think there's any question about that. The key thing here is that the mayor has to know when to be a manager, and one of the toughest jobs that you've got is knowing when to say no to your friends. I can't recall exactly how many labor agreements I've negotiated. It's probably somewhere in the vicinity of 40 to 50. But a couple of characteristics about them. When it's been necessary, I've been tough. There were 7 instances over the years where we ended up in binding arbitration, and I'm very proud to say that the city won every single one of those arbitration cases in those instances. The other thing that I'd note is that we always did bring the labor contracts in on time. That's very critical, not just because of the nature of the contracts, but it creates a collaborative workforce, a collaborative environment that's so critical to doing quality work in city government. It seems to me that what we need to do is recognize that there were some mistakes made by the city in the last 6 to 7 weeks as we had this rush to get these agreements signed, get the photos taken, and then go on. And it seemed like every couple of days we were signing another contract and having another photo op. The point being that the contracts weren't done right because of the rush and because we hadn't had a contract with most of these unions going back through the year 2010. That's something I'll not allow to happen. And so what we did see then was that the contracts were not originally extended as long as they could have been, and they were too rich. It's interesting that it was the unions, not the city, that determined that this was too much of a burden for the city to take.
We'll wrap up that question, and I want to deviate a bit from our script here.
Can I respond to that?
I want to give you the opportunity to respond as well.
Well, you know, I'd say binding arbitration, going to binding arbitration is a sign of failure. Paul failed 7 times, I failed once. And with regard to the union contracts, the reason we had to act so quickly was because we had a governor and a Republican legislature that were bound and determined to turn around 40 years of labor peace, originally in 5 days. And we didn't know, I don't think Paul knew, I don't think anybody knew how this was going to play out. So we sat down with our unions to try to protect them literally from going out of existence. Because if that bill goes into effect, and we reopen the contracts after the bill goes into effect, the union, for all intents and purposes, goes out of existence. And so we came together with our unions to negotiate a contract, again, $5.3 million in savings, and that wasn't proposed by the union, Paul. That was a back and forth negotiation. The union gave up some things to get to that number.
I want to give Mayor Sullivan a chance to
if the unions, first of all, the unions took the credit. You'll have to settle that with them. But certainly if the unions had not brought this up, we would have not had the reopener, and we would not have had the opportunity to save the additional millions of dollars. Now, we've obviously got a different view of the effects of going to arbitration. You see it as a sign of weakness. I see it as representing the best interests overall of the city, and clearly we were right because we prevailed in all 7 cases, unlike the one that you lost. But what's more important to me is the question of the spirit and how that affects the bargaining. We had no contracts in the year 2010. If we had had those contracts, we wouldn't have had to rush, and we could have focused when this crisis hit.
Time's up for that, but where I was going to deviate was to give you the opportunity to say, you know, and this is hindsight's 20/20 type argument, but how would you have handled that after that collective bargaining bill goes through? And I want to give you a chance to respond.
Well, I'm simply going to get to what I think is the critical element here, which is we went from December 31st, 2009 up until mid-February without any labor agreements, even longer than that. And the bottom line is, I wouldn't have been in that situation. I wasn't in that situation. I checked after our last debate when Dave said to me, well, Paul, you probably have that problem. And I checked with several of the unions. I started with the firefighters. They said, no, you brought every single contract in on time with us.
It wouldn't have mattered. We needed to reopen those contracts in order to get the savings to help us avoid layoffs in 2012. So even if the contracts were settled 2 years ago, we still would have reopened them now. We still would have reopened them under the same conditions to try to get those savings for next year.
I appreciate your thoughts, both of you, and I think that's time well spent on that question. We'll move on now. We're joined tonight by some Madisonians with questions of their own, and they're right here in the studio with us. And we start with Scott Friedel. He lives on the city's west side. He is in our studio audience tonight, and he has a question. Scott, go ahead.
What are your proposals to increase revenue in order to provide the funds necessary to continue to improve the quality of life in Madison?
And I believe we'll start with Mayor Soglin first, based on that back and forth.
My guess is that there are very few opportunities to increase revenue. If the governor's proposal goes through, there's going to be caps on taxes, and one of the few other alternatives we'll have is fees. And I'm very reluctant to increase fees simply because fees are regressive. Fees disproportionately hurt low-income families, working families. And so unless we can come up with some alternatives from the state which controls legally the ability of the city to raise revenues, I'm not sure that that's a viable option. Now, there are some other things we can do, however, one of which is to properly use avenues of litigation. I think there are several ways we can be very aggressive, particularly where we have federal agreements, or we've had a reliance factor where the city has entered programming like recycling based on commitments from the state. And I believe, for example, with the 13C agreement, which affects our transit system, that if we handle this thing properly, there's a good chance we could get a court to make it clear that the city's contract with the federal government and its the federal laws will in effect trump the state law. I think the same thing is true in terms of going head-to-head with the state in regards to recycling.
Mayor Czeslavich?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me go back to those contracts. By extending the Metro workers contract by 3 years, we essentially saved the city $21 million because the city gets $7.1 million a year from the federal government for federal transit aids, and they require that there be essentially a collective bargaining agreement. Because we extended those contracts 3 years, for all intents and purposes, we saved the city $21 million. The long-run solution is to grow the tax base, obviously, and we've been doing that through infill development. Hilldale, Monroe Commons, Sequoia Commons, Capitol West, I could go on. But that's the way to really address this problem in the long run. Grow the tax base and grow it primarily through infill development. Expanding
on that question, you guys are both guys who care deeply about the environment. Your track record proves that. Can we grow outside, increase that tax base? That was something I got some feedback from some viewers this week. Can we smartly grow Madison into areas that haven't been developed?
Sure, absolutely. We're planning a neighborhood on the northeast side, actually several neighborhoods called the Northeast Neighborhoods. Now, in decades, that will house 20 to 40,000 people. And we made a point to plan these neighborhoods carefully so that they're dense, mixed-use developments, transit-friendly developments, developments where you can walk to a store or a park or a school, a bike-friendly community, a community that's served by frequent mass transportation so you can get downtown if you don't want to drive. We need to take great care in how we develop on the periphery. We need to treat that land with respect because they're not making it anymore. And at some point, we're going to run into our municipal neighbors and we won't be able to grow any longer. So we've got to be very careful about how we develop on the edges of our community.
Mayor Sawgins, do you want to touch on smart development?
I'd love to. First of all, let's just talk about the expansion question, because one of the things that's I think is most interesting is that the areas that Dave's talking about, and well, most of the areas he's talking about, are areas that I annexed back in the 1990s. A very aggressive annexation program specifically for this reason. And it's something that I oftentimes was criticized for, and I'm glad to see that the mayor is supportive of it. Second thing I want to point out, that if you track investment in development in the city of Madison over the last 25 years and compare it to the rest of Dane County, we, in effect, in the last 3 years, have lost $1.5 billion of new development. And that is in part because of this attitude, and you've got developers like Gary Gorman saying, I'm not building in Madison again. You've got other developers who are saying, you've got your own rules there. I believe that the neighborhoods of Madison, the neighborhood activists, and the developers with proper leadership can work together. We can get the kind of investment that not only builds a tax base, but creates jobs.
We're out of time on that. Did you want to continue the discussion on that?
Yes, please, I would. If you look at the growth in tax base over the last 5 years, the growth in Madison actually mirrors that of the rest of Dane County. It's 12%. If you take Verona out. Verona is an outlier, and Verona is an outlier because of Epic, where Paul used to work. When Epic started to develop in Verona, Verona took off, not just with the Epic properties, but with housing around it. And that is an outlier. But if you take Verona out, then the growth in Madison equals the growth in the rest of Dane County. We actually outpaced Middleton and Fitchburg.
We have a few seconds left if you want to address that.
The point is, we have a horrible reputation. The numbers demonstrate that people do not want to build in Madison the way they used to. And if we're going to do it right, and this particularly relates to the new ordinances that are being prepared on zoning, we have to look at bulk, we have to look at mass, we have to look at density. We have to recognize that if we're going to be efficient in land use, which enhances our transportation system, that we are going to be looking at better relationships in development.
We're going to move on to our next question, and it just speaks to the challenges the mayor of Madison faces. Our next question, submitted via Twitter from D. Thompson Jr., wants to know, after all this talk about trying to create revenues, if either of you has a plan to reduce property tax levels, given the challenges the city is facing. This first to Mayor Soglin.
I mean, very simply, I think it's unrealistic to expect us to reduce property tax levels. I think what we need to do, where we can control the burden, is to deal with the debt service. The debt service is out of control. In my 8 years as mayor, debt service rose about 55%. In Dave's 8 years as mayor, it's risen over 103%, and at least during my years, we've got Monona Terrace to show for it. The point is this: when you get debt service up to 12.5%, it becomes that high in your operating budget, you're not only risking your AAA bond rating, but you don't have the revenues to use for city services. That's what's so critical about it. We've got to maintain the basic services, police, fire, and we certainly have to deal with the most critical issue facing us now, which is the rising record levels of poverty in our community. That, to me, is what's so critical. The mayor has to take responsibility, and I'm going to start with making cuts in the mayor's office. I've been there. I know that the mayor's office is just one of the budgets that's increased the most in the last 8 years, can be cut by at least a net of $150,000.
Mayor Cheslevich, the question was about reducing property tax levels. You can also certainly respond to Mayor Soglin's.
Well, I agree with Paul on the first point. I think it's unrealistic to promise a property tax reduction in this environment. Let me address debt service. Debt was higher under Paul's term than it is under mine. His average debt service each of the 14 years he was in office was 11.45%. Mine is 11.31%. And we are making smart investments in our infrastructure. Paul talks about Monona Terrace. I'm a little bit more of a nuts and bolts guy. I'm investing in rebuilding streets. And we count potholes. I created a program. It's a good management program called Madison Measures. And we count 100 different things, on-the-ground experience people have with our services. And we count potholes. Turns out potholes are down 20% in the last 2 years. Why? Because we're rebuilding streets. That is the most basic of city services. And now's the time to do it. We are getting some of the lowest interest rates ever. We are getting some of the best construction bids ever. And we're putting people to work in good paying construction jobs when they need them.
All right.
I've got to
1
respond,
minute, you bet.
Because the numbers Dave is giving are false. It's simply not true. And the reason is he's giving you debt service, which includes, in my 8 years, Monona Terrace and our stormwater system and our repairs on that. When you're giving the numbers, Dave, for your years, you are excluding Monona Terrace and you're excluding the stormwater utility. So it's completely unfair to give those numbers, and when you properly use my numbers and your numbers, you not only have a higher rate of debt service all 8 years, but you also have taken us up to 14%.
But it doesn't make sense to count. Monona Terrace is currently supported. The bonds on Monona Terrace are supported through the room tax. But it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, Paul. It still comes out of the general fund. Whether it's supported by the property tax literally or through the room tax, it's still room tax revenues that could go to reduce the property tax.
So are you going to use Monona Terrace in your numbers when I'm mayor? Or are you going to use Monona Terrace in your numbers when you're mayor?
Yes, we should use Monona Terrace in the overall numbers.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Then your numbers are wrong.
We're going to move on to the next question, and several folks posing questions about the city's water quality. Of course, that's been a highly publicized issue over the last several years. Carol Fainick is among them, and she's in our audience tonight, and she has a question here in person. Carol?
Hello. First of all, I want to thank Channel 3 for giving citizens a chance to be part of this process. One of my questions is, in recent years, there have been highly publicized issues focusing on Madison's water supply, and these have really concerned me, and they include concerns about the levels of manganese and, more recently, chromium-6. And I'm wondering how each of the candidates would effectively address these issues and ensure the safety of our water supply.
And this first posed to Mayor Cheslevich.
Sure.
2 minutes.
That's an excellent question. Thanks for answering it. I have been concerned, too. Now, first of all, I want to assure people that our water supply is excellent and very safe. We have had some issues, and the issues of manganese were not primarily health issues, but they were discoloration issues. We moved to address that issue. We made some management changes at the utility. We're putting actually very expensive filters on some of our wells, which have the highest levels of manganese, and I think we can get at that problem. We've also been investing in water utility infrastructure, rebuilding sewer mains, water mains at a very rapid rate. We're bringing to an end the long process of replacing all of the lead services and lead mains, which actually were a far bigger health threat than manganese. Chromium-6, something to keep an eye on. The Environmental Working Group did issue a report, and we responded immediately and tested all of our wells. We didn't have to, but we tested all of our wells, and we found that all of the readings in the wells were well below areas that should bring a health concern. But we need to definitely keep an eye on it. And I will say that the Environmental Working Group complimented the City of Madison on its response to their report.
Mayor Sogin.
Yes. I think we have to understand two things about our water utility. First, that we can solve the problems. There's no question about that. The second thing is that we can do much better. The issues of chemicals in the water will continue to be one we have to pay careful attention to, and we cannot leave it out of sight, out of mind. That's very important. The mayor's staff has to work continually with the water utility on these issues. We have to do a second thing, which is we still have some old lead fixtures that need replacing. That I'm confident we can do. There are also about 40 years worth of piping that needs replacing. We have to get ourselves on a firm schedule and stay with it. Lastly, we do have some problems in terms of capacity. And the problems of capacity are presented both as a financial matter and in meeting the areas of growth within the community, but they present another dilemma, which is if we don't increase that capacity and we still have the demand, the physics of water is such that if we keep up the demand and the pumping, we are actually going to compromise the existing system. We need a plan. And there's no question that we as a community have the capability of doing it. We have the resources to do it. I'm simply concerned that because we've had this out of sight, out of mind attitude for so long, that we're going to have to play catch up for a number of years.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. We'll move on a bit and look more at some of the policy positions. And it has been written, some watching this race, perhaps those who haven't been here tonight, have said on many of the issues it's hard to tell the two of you apart. Describe a critical policy difference between you and your opponent. We begin this question with Mayor Soglin.
Well, I think there's no question that on the matter of poverty and the record rates that we've got, there's a critical difference between Dave and myself. I say it's the number one issue. It's the issue that we must address, that the mayor must get up every single morning and be prepared to tackle with a team that focuses on transportation, job training and education, quality child care, housing, and health care. There's no one in our county who's responsible for all of these areas, yet they are indispensable. They are indispensable in terms of making households economically sustainable. If we've got someone in a job training program and they've got good housing, but they don't have transportation and they don't have child care for their 3-year-old, it's all for naught. This is something we've done in the past, and we've also done it by providing the neighborhood resource teams. Now, one of the big differences here is that Dave defines the issue as the absence of crime. Now, in this city since 1994, we've pretty much seen a steady decline in crime, which matches what we've known from Freakonomics, namely that as the demographics change in terms of the number of young males in a community, crime declines. I don't look at the measurement of crime as the way to measure how well we're doing. When 51% of our kids are at or below the poverty line, when we've got schools with 70% of our kids under the poverty line, that is the number one compelling issue we need to address. You know, Dave just said the other day that there's not much that a mayor can do about poverty, that it's a national issue. If it was a national issue, then only controlled by the national economy, then every city's unemployment rate, every city's problems would track whatever the national rates are. But here in Madison, we can do better. We have to have a mayor who believes that the city and its community can do something about poverty.
Mayor Soglin, thank you. Your chance to answer.
I care deeply about the issue of poverty, but rather than just talking about how it was done 15, 20 years ago, I did something about it in the last few years. When I came to office, Allied Drive was the most challenged neighborhood in our community. We invested millions of dollars in Allied Drive, bought 20% of the housing there, and I had to fight for that before the city council. I won that vote by 1 vote. A lot of people thought that it wasn't the right thing to do, but it turned out to be the right thing to do. We worked with the neighborhood for a year. We redesigned that whole development, and today, Allied Drive is much healthier. The quality of life there is much healthier. Crime is down 53%. And I disagree, Paul. I don't define a healthy neighborhood as just the absence of crime. It's a much stronger neighborhood in every way. Currently, we're working on trying to get a grocery store there. And as for the thing that I disagree with Paul on, we were at a forum a few weeks ago, and Paul said that the protests at the Capitol were not a game changer. Those were his words, not a game changer. I think they were a game changer. I think we may see that in a few days with the election of Joanne Kloppenburg to the Supreme Court. I think we may see it with the recall of 3 senators that might flip the Senate back to Democrats. I think that those protests were a game changer.
Your thoughts on that? I mean,
Dave's taking my comment out of context, and it does little to solve the problem that he thinks that the city can't do anything about poverty. When I said it wasn't a game changer, I was making the point that those of us who are opposed to the governor's policies are not going to get the governor to change. That doesn't mean it didn't make change. For example, I also pointed out that there is all these other states that were going to do these draconian measures, and with the exception of Ohio, what we did here in Wisconsin had a profound effect around the rest of the country, and we are having changes. The changes are taking place among the community of moderate Republicans. It's taking place in the business community who are sending a message to Governor Walker, not in our name. Do not do this in our name. My point is that Governor Walker is not responding, and he won't respond unless we, in effect, undermine his political base. I'd rather look at it a positive way, which is for his political base, or a significant part of it, to say to Governor Walker, we believe in collective bargaining rights. We don't think this is necessary to solve the budget problems.
Okay, well, we're up time-wise on that question. Our next one also comes via Twitter tonight from local journalist and author who has also served on the county board. Stu Levitan wants to know, is a little deeper on you, drawing a little more deeply on your experiences. Biggest mistake you made as mayor, why did you make that mistake? What did you learn? So a three-parter. Biggest mistake you made as mayor, why you made that mistake as you look back on it, and what you learned from it. And this goes first to Mayor Cheslevich.
Well, my biggest mistake was not getting Paul to buy breakfast more often. We had all those breakfasts all those years, and he never told me that he was interested in running for mayor again or that he had a problem with my leadership. But so I wish I had made him pay off more often. My serious answer to that question is the RTA. I believed that if we had gone to referendum back in November on the Regional Transit Authority, gone to referendum on the question of a sales tax to fund and expand mass transit in our county, I think we would have won. If you look at the MATC referendum, for example, it won easily. I couldn't get enough support on that from others who were interested in the issue, and so I didn't push on it. I wish I had, because I think if we had done that, the RTA would be in place today. It still may come under attack from the legislature, as it is now, but I think it would have had a greater chance of surviving that attack.
And you learned from that going forward?
Well, you'd be a little bit more firm with my friends, because some of my friends on that issue did not think it was a good idea to go forward, and I deferred to their judgment.
Mayor Soglin.
Well, at times I've said that the biggest, at least on a personal basis, the biggest mistake I made was submitting my resignation for 1997, and I think there's two things that would have certainly been different. One is Epic would not have left Madison if I'd been mayor, and secondly, Overture never would have evolved the way it is. But my guess is, and I'm glad that there's going to be an opportunity if I'm elected to work on this. It has to deal with land use, annexation, and working with surrounding communities. In the earlier years, I was really focused on annexation, the idea being that other communities should not be able to cherry pick the best of Madison services and avoid other responsibilities, like for parks and recreation, for cultural affairs, for supporting Madison Metro. And so the notion was, if you want these services, you have to come into the city. And that was principally designed to be fair to Madison taxpayers, who can't pick off of a menu, I want these 4 services and I don't want to pay for the other 8. In the latter years, we started moving more and more towards contracts and land use agreements with surrounding communities. And I believe that, especially in light of what Governor Walker's done, there are tremendous opportunities and potential for us to partner. You know, years ago, we signed a contract with Oregon. Town of Oregon had 1 stoplight in the middle of town. It was ridiculous for them to create a department or a staff person to maintain it. So we took care of, through our traffic engineering, their 1 stop and go light. There are other opportunities like that in police and fire service, in terms of street sweeping, in terms of all the functions. And one of the things that the mayor has to do is immediately start partnering with other levels of government and with surrounding towns, villages, and cities to see how we can all do better together.
All right,
let me furiously agree with that.
Okay.
We now have over 100 contracts like the one Paul mentioned about the stoplight, and that's an entrepreneurial way of looking at government. We can provide services to those communities, usually at a cost that's much lower than them having to invest in all the infrastructure and personnel, and it helps our bottom line as well. I think that kind of regional cooperation is something that we need to do more of. I'm very pleased to have the support of my good friend Kathleen Falk in this race. Joe Parisi has also been supporting my campaign. I'll work very well with Joe. and a good working relationship with the Dane County cities and villages and the surrounding officials there.
All right.
I didn't know I was going to talk about the subject and open the door for Dave to list all of his endorsements.
Yeah,
I'm going to pass on that, but I do want to say one other thing.
I've got more endorsements to list, that's the thing.
Is that it builds trust. So when you're working on that stoplight, when you're working on that joint service, you're not only doing something for the taxpayers, but you're building trust between those governments.
Okay, we move on to our next question, gentlemen. Mayor Soglin, Councilmember Tim Brewer said this week, he was quoted in the Wisconsin State Journal, and the mayor has alluded to this as well recently, that things have changed a lot since you were mayor and you'd have to relearn some things. Would you care to address that? And we begin this with you, and we'll give the mayor a chance to...
This is one of the most bizarre things I've heard. I've had 19 years in government, 19 years. Dave came into office with no experience with the city. Now, what's happened in the years that I've not been in office? Let's see. I've taught 5 different graduate courses on government, personnel practices, advanced public management, 1 course on privatization, and of course, the work that I do on teaching the public budgeting class. The Government Finance Officers Association asked me to chair one of their commissions a few years ago in regards to new processes for all levels of government to do budgeting. Interestingly enough, some of the changes that Dave's recommending that he wants to do in the city budget are from sections that I wrote. I've been very active, anyone who's read my blog, in knowing that I've been commenting and involved in things involving everything from the troubles at Meadowood, where Dave had a hostile audience, to a report I just finished last fall studying Madison South Side and the interrelationship of nonprofits, of the private sector and the city and the county. I don't know what needs more to be said, except that it sounds to me that what they're basically saying is that an incumbent should never be removed from office by any challenger. And imagine what happens to the poor challengers who don't have the experience I've had.
Thank you, and I want to give you a chance to respond to that and maybe say what, 14 years, what has changed?
A lot has changed. I mean, 14 years ago, Facebook, Google, YouTube didn't exist. 14 years ago, Brett Favre was still quarterback of the Green Bay Packers. 14 years ago, we had virtually no internet presence in the city of Madison. Today, virtually all my correspondence comes through internet. There's a 24-hour news cycle. Paul would actually eliminate the public relations position in the mayor's office, the person who handles that much greater traffic in terms of communicating with the public at a key time that we need to communicate with the public. Paul would eliminate a position called the fiscal efficiency auditor, which he actually praised when that person did a report on Overture. Now he removed it. Now, that is a position that we absolutely need as we look at the city budget to see where we can find savings and efficiencies going forward in this very tight budget. Here's a fundamental thing that's changed since the last time Paul was mayor. When Paul was mayor in 1997, 22% of the city budget came from state and federal aids. Today it's 15%. We have managed through 3 of the toughest recession years since the Great Depression with much less outside support than Paul ever had. And we've done it without slashing services, without mass layoffs, without resorting to fiscal gimmicks, and without losing our AAA bond rating.
I know Mayor Soglin wants to respond, but along those lines, Mayor Cheslevich, just when you took this job 8 years ago, as Mayor Soglin, I think, pointed out, you learned on the job as well, correct?
Absolutely.
And how's that? I mean, it was your first time as mayor? I mean, just along those lines, just...
Sure. Well, but Paul had been out of office, too, for 6 years. Mm-hmm. So, look, I think that I am a better mayor today than I was 8 years ago. But the case that Paul has to make is a case to change competent leadership today. With all the challenges that we have today, Paul has not made a case to change the competent leadership that we've demonstrated.
I know you want to respond.
This is getting silly. This really is. I mean, look at it. First of all, we did have the internet when I was mayor, and in fact, the city of Madison was one of the first cities in the United States to launch a website and have a web presence. And in addition to that, when you give these figures about the losses in revenues, I actually had to deal with far greater losses than that in my tenure as mayor. Your 7% is nothing compared to the 17% I had to contend with. But here's the real kicker. I was blogging and had at least 1,000 posts on my blog before Dave ever started. I mean, what does that make me? It must be some kind of really skilled. I mean, the point is we're talking about issues that are not relevant to the qualities for a mayor. Mayor has to be able to lead. Mayor has to be able to engage a community to deal with poverty. A mayor has to have the confidence of neighborhood groups, neighborhood associations, developers, all the people that make for a great city.
Thank you very much for the lively discussion. I want to move on to our next question. We are getting towards the end here. We take another question from our audience, and for this one, we go to James Ty III. James?
Thank you very much. My question is, the lakes are widely considered one of Madison's greatest assets, yet water quality poses many challenges for area residents and visitors every year. What role do you think Madison should play in the revitalization of our lakes? And second part, how would you prioritize that with other civic efforts such as the public library, the public market, and other things like that?
This is first to Mayor Cieslewicz.
Sure. Behind our public schools and the university, the lakes are our most important asset. We've done a lot in the last 8 years. We launched a 1,000 rain garden program. We increased street sweeping. We passed a phosphorus fertilizer ban. But there's much more that we need to do. Actually, the major problem that we have, though, with our lakes is the pollutants flowing from agricultural uses north of Lake Mendota. And so I applaud the county executive's effort to build a couple of manure digesters, which may not sound very sexy, but what they're about is really handling the manure that's produced in those farms north of Lake Mendota in a much more environmentally sensitive way. That's probably the single best thing we can do to clean up the lakes in the long run. Now, we've done some things just this last summer that we've experimented with, and we'll do more next year in terms of trying to make our beaches more swimmable, using booms and such to keep algae and other things out of those swimming areas. But James asked an absolutely critical question, and what we need is a greater regional effort. I've always felt that the Lakes and Watershed Commission needs to do more. They are the governmental body that can see beyond the municipal boundaries. And so there's a lot more to do, but I think those are steps in the right direction.
Mayor Soglin.
One thing that has not changed over the years is the fact that phosphorus runoff, particularly from outside of the city, is the principal source of nutrients that grow the weeds in our lakes, principally Mendota, Monona, and Wingra. That is now being addressed by the county in an effort to see whether or not the manure biodigesters will provide an economic means of removing the phosphorus. But in the meantime, there are several other issues related to the lake quality. The most serious one that's here in Madison that is controllable is the high bacteria counts, which lead up to 40 days of closing of the beaches during the summer. And oftentimes, that is happening, of course, in the hottest days of the summer. A lot of it is related to the waterfowl problems, particularly the geese that inhabit the areas. What is most frustrating, I'm really pledged to setting a goal of 0 days of beach closings, is that we've now come up with humane solutions as to handling the geese population and ways of discouraging them from entering the waterways so they'll find another habitat, and that will significantly improve the water quality. And that's one thing I'm pledged to, and that is dealing with this bacterial problem.
Okay, we move on. Also, speaking of Lake Mendota, we are going to move this discussion on to the Edgewater Hotel debate. A lot of questions we got this week regarding the Edgewater Hotel debate from our viewers. And looking at the situation now, and this first goes to Mayor Soglin, looking at the situation now, what, if anything, would you have done differently in this situation as Madison's mayor?
The whole dynamic would have changed. What we ended up with is the mayor making a commitment to a developer, overextending that commitment. Consequently, it sidestepped and cut off the neighborhood association, which got very upset. They became intransigent. In the meantime, the developer, convinced that the mayor had his back, he became intransigent. We ended up with this. It's now been over 2 years And of course, the shovel hasn't even been turned. We see a $16 million TIF. We've seen these wonderful arguments made that this is good for the economy, and yet no one's been hired. What would have been different, and this is the role of the mayor. The role of the mayor is to embrace a project conceptually, bring together the parties, get the project going through the system, which involves neighborhood associations and the neighborhood activists, the plan commission, the plan department staff, and the mayor's responsibility is to see that it moves along and that the objectives of the city are met. That's the role of the mayor, and when you look at the projects I've handled over the years, whether it was the State Street Mall or Monona Terrace, you know, Monona Terrace involved 3 levels of government. It involved complicated financing. It involved a complicated, well, I want to get into there's some environmental issues that were involved on the lake, just as the Edgewater. The point is, we got it done. And this administration, time after time, it's not just the Edgewater, it's all the false starts that we had with the public library. It's Gary Gorman walking away saying, I'll never do business with the city again. It's real curious. I've got all these developers and all these neighborhood activists supporting my campaign. They have a common goal.
Mayor Cheslevich, your chance to respond. 2 minutes.
Well, you know, Paul forgets how difficult Monona Terrace was. I mean, that came down to a referendum, a bloody fight over a lake easement. The referendum passed just barely by the skin of its teeth, even after much, much more money was spent in support of that than against it. It was a bloody, bloody fight. But today, Monona Terrace is a great success, and I believe that someday the Edgewater will be a great success. I did support that project at some political cost to me. I understand that, but I did it because I believe it's the right thing for the city. We need jobs. In some trades, 1 out of 3 workers is unemployed. Those are good family-supporting jobs. We need tax base. That's $100 million in tax base at a time when our tax base is pretty much stagnant thanks to the recession. And we need lake access at that point. The University of Wisconsin, Biddy Martin, supports the project because she sees it as an amenity that the university can use as people visit the city. We need another top-quality hotel like that one. And I thought it sent a positive signal in the middle of a deep recession that Madison can get this project done. And it got through all the approvals. In fact, one approval was a 16-vote item. 16 out of 20 Madison alders voted for that project. This wasn't just the mayor pushing it. 16 out of 20 alders voted for it. I do think it was the right thing to do for the city. I understand that I lost some political support for it. I'm sorry about that. I wish that didn't have to happen. But that's sometimes what a mayor has to do. They need to do things that they believe are right for the city, even if at their political peril.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. We have about 15 seconds, and then we're going to closing arguments. Well, I appreciate both of you being here tonight and your staffs as well for accommodating our request for this debate. It's been a good discussion. Before the debate, we flipped a coin to see who would go first in closing statements. Mayor Cheslevich won. He elected to go second. Each candidate gets 1 minute, and Mayor Soglin, we begin with you with your closing comment.
Thank you very much, and thank the audience for the patience of putting up with us.
Absolutely.
When I first made the decision, I had to obviously get the support of my family, and Sarah made an observation, and she said, you're happiest when you're mayor. Maybe that's a reflection on the rest of my life, but I am happy being mayor, and I love the job. It's a tough job, and I want to get in there and deal with these really critical issues that face our city. I see poverty as a very, very difficult challenge, but we have done it in the past, and I've been intimately involved with the elements dealing with poverty and that work I've been doing over the last 3 years. I want to see our neighborhood activists and our developers working side by side. They're not going to agree on everything, but we want to get prompt resolution so we can not only create the affordable housing we need, but the place for the jobs, and really take Madison from the bottom of the list to the top of the list on creating economic opportunity.
Thank you, Mayor Soglin. Mayor Cheslevich, 1 minute.
Thank you. I'm less interested in what happened in 1997 than I am in what can happen in 2011 and 2012 and 2013 and beyond. I've never been so proud to be mayor of this city as I have been in the last 8 weeks. We live in a city where we had hundreds of thousands of protesters come through our downtown, and the police report to me that the biggest problem was lost children. And they're very proud that the maximum time it took them to unite a child with a parent was 4 minutes. We live in a community where the protesters inside the Capitol building used tape that didn't leave adhesive on the walls because they cared for that building so much. One of my favorite quotes is from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said that what lies behind us and what lies before us matters little compared to what lies within us. We face challenges ahead as a community, but if we stay together and we use the Madison community spirit and creativity, we will come through this. I'd like to lead Madison as we discover what lies within us.
All right. Mayor Cheslevich, Mayor Soglin, both thank you very much for stopping by Channel 3 tonight. Thanks for your time. Thanks to our viewers for tuning in, and thanks for all of those who contributed questions. As a reminder as well, you can find complete campaign coverage leading up to and on Election Day right here on News 3 and channel3000.com. Good night for now. We'll see you back here in an hour for News 3 at 10. Have a great weekend.